Hello, my name is Yechezkel Bund. Welcome to today's lecture about DNA and genetic genealogy from the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. You can learn more about the Institute at www.genealogicalstudies.com. The subject of tonight's presentation is a very brief introduction to chromosome mapping. First, we're going to talk about the underlying DNA concepts behind it. Then we're going to tell a very basic step-by-step of how to do it. And then we're going to conclude by talking about some of the benefits of chromosome mapping. Now, before you do anything with DNA research, you have to remember, DNA research is like a gift. It can be a wonderful surprise, or it can open a Pandora's box. So be prepared for that and be aware before you do anything with your DNA. So, what is a chromosome? A chromosome is a teeny instruction book inside your cells. This information is stored in DNA. These chromosomes decide things like your eye color, height, and even some of your personality traits. Humans have 46 chromosomes in almost every cell, arranged in 23 pairs. And this graphic down here shows how the chromosomes look in the cell. And you'll note that some chromosomes are bigger than others. That's why when you see a chromosome map, some chromosomes are longer than others on the map. So you inherit half of your chromosomes from your mother and half from your father. And each of those chromosomes makes a part of the pair. So, for example, this is the beginnings of a chromosome map. If this was one chromosome being mapped, the paternal chromosomes would be on top and the maternal chromosomes would be on bottom. Now, in reality, when you inherit a chromosome for your parent, it consists of DNA from each of their parents, and then one or more of your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, going back through the lines of each parent. And as you can see in this diagram, the top is the paternal grandparents. So you can see what this person inherited from their paternal grandmother and their paternal grandfather. And the side underneath is the maternal grandfather and maternal grandmother. And you'll note that it's not exactly equal because we don't inherit after our parents from our relatives going further back exactly the same amount of DNA. You can inherit, for example, 30% from your paternal grandmother and 20% from your paternal grandfather. So that's something to keep in mind when mapping. And you'll also note that it's very rare to inherit a full chromosome from one of your grandparents. So as you can see, it's broken up a bit on the chromosome. The first segment is the paternal grandfather, then there's the paternal grandmother segment, and then there's another segment from the paternal grandfather. And the same holds true for the paternal great-grandparents, maternal great-grandparents, which you can see here, and going back further and further through your family line. So what is chromosome mapping? Chromosome mapping is figuring out and identifying which DNA segments on your chromosome come from which ancestor, like our prior examples, and drawing them on a chromosome map template. So this is a template that's blank, and here is a completed DNA map. So as you can see, the different segments are colored in different colors, and the ancestor that they've been assigned to, that they came from, is in the legend down here next to the color. So there's a couple of things to remember before we get started. One, we only chromosome map autosomal DNA. That's the DNA you inherit from both your parents, going back several generations. If you were born genetically female, you have two X chromosomes. If you were born genetically male, you have one X and one Y chromosome. And we do not chromosome map Y DNA because it mutates so slowly, you're very likely to have the same Y DNA profile as ancestors who lived hundreds of years ago. And these are also, in most cases, there are certain disorders which may have an extra chromosome, but that's outside the boundaries of this discussion this evening. Okay, so The first thing you need to chromosome paint is you must have your matches segment data from the different DNA companies. The segment data is on what chromosomes you and your match and the location on the chromosomes of the matching segments. Now, Ancestry and 23andMe do not have any chromosome segment data available for your matches. The other companies, as you see here, do. Okay, so what I decided to do was I made a physical representation of the genealogical tree of the match that I'm going to be mapping. Now, these names are pseudonyms, and the pictures are not related to anybody with the DNA. But I wanted to show you. So the tester is I given the name John Smith. And we're mapping his segments with his third cousin once removed, David Berg and Linda Berg. Now, what you can note here from this graphic representation, both David Berg and John Smith are male descendants from direct female lines from their most recent common ancestor, who I've named Zusha Pelosi and Rachel Klein Poloni. The reason that it's important that to remember when we're mapping what we believe are the ancestral segments from this couple is that both David and John are direct descendants of female lines. So that means they share the same mtDNA, which is a kind of DNA which is not autosomal DNA and is also not mapped, that women pass on to their sons and daughters, but it only continues down the female line. And there also, as you will see, an X DNA match. Okay, so how do we make a chromosome map? Step one, sign up for a free account at the DNA Painter website. You just have to register with a username and password. Now, two very nice things about DNA Painter is you don't need to upload your raw DNA data. And your chromosome map is private. No one else could view it unless you would like someone else to view it. You can also download it. But if you don't want to share it, it's 100% private. There's also a paid tier where you can make more than one chromosome map if you wish and do some other things. But it's very good to start with the free account and start with one map, which is what we're doing tonight. Now, at the website, there are many articles, videos, and all kinds of resources about how to chromosome map and what you can do with it. So I highly suggest you check out the site and its various articles about chromosome mapping for further education. Okay, so at the DNA Painter site, you click on the top chromosome maps, and you can see there's a wonderful video for Blaine Bettinger there, if you'd like to watch that. And you click on Create New Map. And you go to this screen that gives you a little bit of information about chromosome mapping. And you get the option as to what you'd like to call the map. Now, I'm calling it the Poloni map because that's the family line that I am mapping. And it's also going to ask you for the map, the person you're mapping sex. The reason it does that is, remember, because if it's a male, there'll be one line for the X chromosome. And if it's a female, there'll be two lines to map for the X chromosome. So you go to the next step, and this is where you paste the segment data in. How to get the data. You see here where it says segment data guide, and it explains how to get it from each company. It's a simple process. It takes a couple of steps. So everything you need to know about that is here. Now, this is the most important concept when you are chromosome mappings. You see here, it says exclude segments under 7 centimorgans. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, this is the data you paste in from the DNA company. This number here on the extreme left is the chromosome it's found on. These larger numbers are the location on the chromosome, where it begins, where it ends. This number is the amount of centimorgans, and this here is the amount of SNPs, which is the genetic letter code at the site. But it's important to understand centimorgans are simply the measurement of how long the DNA segment is. For example, in the example we're showing, there's a segment of 6.88 centimorgans, 10.09 centimorgans. There's a large segment on the X chromosome, 32.04 centimorgans. So you have to decide which of these segments you're going to allow in and which you're going to exclude. Now, the basic is 7 centimeters at the site. That's what it's set for. You can make it lower, you can make it higher. Now, if you're from an endogamous community, and an endogamous community is a community that only married and had children within that community, be it a geographic location or a religious community, for many centuries. And they often come from a small bottleneck of founders. So if you're from an endogamous community, you should set it higher for perhaps 10 centimorgans up to 20 centimorgans, especially when you're dealing with matches on the X chromosome. A good rule of thumb to understand is that you're looking for segments that are identical by descent, meaning segments that you and your matcher share from a common ancestor. But there's something called false segments, which aren't segments based on common ancestors. And a good rule of thumb is the smaller the segment, the more likely it is to be not identical by descent. And this is especially true in endogamous communities. So really, it's a balance between finding identical by descent segments, and eliminating false segments. You don't want to set it too high, so you take out the identical, but some smaller identical by descent segments. But at the same time, you don't want to set it too low to get too many false segments. But really, I think it's something, and this is one of the beauties of chromosome matching. With time, you really learn to understand your DNA. So you get a feel for your segment size. And also at the DNA Painter website, there's a wonderful article about chromosome mapping in endogamy. So I strongly suggest you read that. It's by Lara Diamond. Now, two kinds of segments which are not really identical by descent or pileup regions, those are segments which are found in every member virtually of a different ethnic group or geographic location. And there's also something called sticky segments. Now, you don't have to understand too much in depth, but a sticky segment is basically a segment which passes through many generations intact. It doesn't break up and recombine. In other words, it's a segment that instead of breaking up because you've inherited from both of your parents, it is a segment that you inherit this small piece from one of your parents or even both, and it just continues to stay the same size from very, very far back. Now, at Borland Genetics, there is a tool to analyze sticky segments. You put in the amount of centimorgans of the segment, and it will tell you what the chances are and how long it may have been not passing through the generations without breaking up. And for example, there's a 6% chance that a 7 centimorgan segment has been passed down untouched for over 1,000 years. So this is the pie chart. So yes, you can see here that it's probably less than 100. There's approximately 25% chance it's less than 100 years. It's halfway chance that it is from between 200 to 300 years, but the rest of this is a longer time. And what he says, for example, in a very endogamous population, if you see that you have a zillion matches on a lot of the same segments, then the common ancestor from which they all inherited the sticky segment will often have lived 1,000 years ago and may be an ancestor of a large swath of the population. If you don't understand this concept 100%, It's okay. The reason I'm sharing it is because I want you to understand a little bit about how segment size, when you're dealing with chromosome mapping, is very important. And that's the main factor you have to take into account. So so what I did is, as you can see, this is John Smith's match, David Berg. So as you saw earlier, I took his segment data, I pasted it into DNA Painter, I hit save, and now we come to this screen. Now, I know how I'm connected to this match. I know how the matches are connected. I enter the name of the match, David Berg. And another nice feature of Chromosome Painter is that you can add notes. So for example, if I know that on chromosome 13, I have a lot of matches, and I noted from David that I have those, we have a match in that position, you could write it here as a match note or a segment note. You could also write, if you're interested, what company the person you got the match from. There's a lot of different data here that will help you. You can write that'll help you move your research along. Next, it says enter the ancestor's name or the name of the couple. So I like to put the father's back ancestor. So I know earlier that Zusha and Rachel Klein Poloni, they are the father's back ancestor. Then is the match on your mother's side or your father's side? So this was a maternal match. And also here is where you pick the color for the map. If you don't want this color or you already used it for another match, there's a variety of colors. And now here you can put notes for the whole group. Everyone who you will be descended or connected to this couple. So for example, I often put the location of the couple. For example, if they're from Vienna, I also put, for example, the years that the most recent common ancestor couple lived and their birth years, their death years. I put whatever information here I want to recall that'll help me, because in the future, you'll be looking at using this chromosome map many times. So then you hit save, and then you repeat this process for each match you want on your chromosome map. And the only difference would be, for example, you might put in a different ancestral couple. So after I did this for David Berg, I did it for his daughter, Linda. And this is what the chromosome map basically looks like. These are the segments I share with them in common. And as you can see here on the X chromosome, there's a large segment, 32 centimorgans, as we saw in the data. And if this was clickable, you can click and you could see the name of the people who match you on this segment. You could also click on the segment and it'll give you a little bit more information about the sizes and everything else about the matches on that segment, so you can compare it. And you also see that what the color that was assigned to it by DNA Painter now links to their name, Zusha and Rachel Klein Poloni. So this is the first step. And as you find more matches and more most recent common ancestors, you would continue the process. Now, the reason why I set it at 7 centimorgans, and I spoke to you a little bit about segment sizes, was because there's something very interesting about this match. There are two segments. One is 10 centimorgans and the other is 7 centimorgans that Linda shares with John Smith that her father doesn't share with John Smith. So that means that those segments did not come to Linda through David Berg. So what does that mean? It means very likely that these segments are not identical by descent segments. They could be, for example, if Linda shares an ancestor with John, perhaps through her mother, or they could be segments that we talked about that are false segments for some other reason. So this just shows you that it's very important when you're chromosome mapping, take into consideration the size of the segments and what they might be. And if you could triangulate between For example, a situation like this where you have the match, there's a parent and a child, it'll help you get a better picture of the different segments and what lines you're related to them on. Okay, so the benefits of chromosome mapping. You can learn where unidentified DNA matches fit into your tree genealogically by identifying the most recent common ancestor based on where the match locates on your chromosome. For example, if I have other matches who match on these segments, especially if they're significantly large segments, then it's very likely that the matches share a common ancestor on this line. Also, something else you can map at DNA Painter is traits. For example, on the chromosome map, you'll see little pins. For example, this is the pin for baldness on the X chromosome. This is the pin for color blindness. So what happens is at these spots on the X chromosome, that is where those traits are. And so it gives you a little bit of more information of who you may have inherited the trait from. And you could also do some reverse engineering going backwards. And for example, if you know which ancestor you inherited the trait from, then you know where they are on your chromosome. Now, in addition to your traits, you can also map your ethnicity, the different segments. For example, at different companies, it'll show you this point on your chromosome is Swiss, or this point is from Russia. And those segments, those locations can also be put onto the chromosome map. And as I told you earlier, I think the primary benefit of chromosome mapping is you learn to know and understand your DNA on such a deep and intuitive level, you can really make big breakthroughs. For example, with time, you will see segments that, yes, they're not really from identical by descent. They're not from a common ancestor. They're common to everybody in the population, which I mentioned is a pileup region, or you find so many of your relatives have this. As I said, it's a sticky segment, a segment that hasn't broken down. Or if it's a very small segment, as I said, that a match where you have both the parent and child's DNA segments, and it's only found in the parent and not the child, then that is a sign it's not identical by descent from the ancestor you're mapping. And really, the more you learn about your DNA, the more you can push your genealogical research forward. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you all are now willing to try chromosome mapping. Thank you very much.